In the quiet of an ordinary morning, Eliot, a young teen from a modest background, finds himself at the center of an extraordinary moment. When he saves a millionaire from a life-threatening car accident, his simple act of courage sets in motion a chain of events that could alter the course of his life forever. This is a story about how one decision can change everything, how a single act of kindness can open doors to a future Eliot never imagined. Join us as we begin this unforgettable journey. Eliot Hayes, a young man barely out of his teens, drove down the sleepy suburban streets of Maple Ridge, his tired old car humming and rattling as it always did. The engine sputtered, the body creaked, and the tires seemed to fight for every inch of pavement. But Eliot had grown accustomed to it all. This was his car, and despite the dents and rust that seemed to tell the story of years of wear, it was his companion, his reliable source of transport, taking him through the same route, day after day. His uniform, a faded navy blue shirt with the grocery store's worn-out logo on the breast pocket, clung to him a little tighter than usual. The fabric had thinned over the years, the sleeves frayed, and the collar soft from too many washes. But Eliot didn't mind. It was just part of the routine. He barely thought about the work anymore, stacking shelves, scanning groceries, making small talk with customers. It wasn't the job he dreamed of, but it paid the bills. And right now, that was all that mattered. His shift would start in just 20 minutes, and if he didn't hustle, he'd be late again. He couldn't afford that. Not today. The quiet suburb of Maple Ridge slowly began to wake up around him. The sun was still low, casting long, slanted beams of golden light across the neat rows of houses. A few early risers were already out walking their dogs, their figures outlined by the soft glow of dawn. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car that passed by, each of them lost in their own routine, moving at the same pace, the same rhythm. It was the kind of morning that felt both ordinary and serene, the kind of morning where nothing really seemed to change. But even as Eliot adjusted the rearview mirror and glanced at the clock on the dashboard, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. The air felt a little heavier, as if it was holding something back, something just beyond reach. It wasn't that he could pinpoint it, not exactly. It was a vague unease, a quiet tension that buzzed just below the surface. Maybe it was the car's strange rattle, a sound that seemed a little sharper today, a little more insistent. Or maybe it was just that, for the first time in a long while, Eliot found himself thinking about the future, the things he wanted to change, the things he was afraid of. He shook the thought away and gripped the steering wheel tighter. The car rattled again, sending a shiver down his spine. He focused on the road ahead. Maple Ridge was still a small town, tucked away in the farthest corner of the county. It was easy to get lost in it, to slip through unnoticed. For years, Eliot had done just that, always staying on the margins, never drawing attention. He had learned to live like this, quietly, almost invisibly. It was safer that way, less risky. But today, as the sun bathed the empty streets in its warm embrace, Eliot couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was about to change. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, pushing the car forward as it crept past the rows of identical houses. The trees lining the streets were tall, their branches reaching out like fingers toward the sky, casting long shadows over the pavement. Everything about Maple Ridge was still and quiet, almost like a painting. But Eliot couldn't shake the feeling that the calmness was only an illusion. As the car jolted over a pothole, Eliot's eyes flicked to the side mirror. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, just a flash of color and motion. A sudden noise made him glance ahead again, his mind still half focused on the rearview. That's when he saw it. Up ahead, tucked just off the side of the road, was a black sedan, its sleek body tilted awkwardly into a deep ditch. The car's front end was buried in the earth, and the windshield had shattered, scattering jagged shards of glass across the grass. His heart skipped a beat. There was no sign of movement from the car, no indication of life or breath, just the stillness of the wreckage. Something tugged at Eliot's gut, an instinct, a pull he couldn't explain. He didn't even think. His foot lifted off the accelerator, and his hands instinctively turned the wheel, pulling the car over to the shoulder of the road. The engine sputtered as he braked hard, the tires screeching slightly against the gravel. He threw open the door and stepped out into the morning air, his breath catching in his throat. The wrecked car had a dark aura about it, the kind of scene that made the air feel thick with dread. But Eliot didn't hesitate. His eyes scanned the ground, looking for any signs of life. That's when he saw it. A figure lying beside the car, his arm weakly raised as if reaching for help. Eliot's heart raced as he moved toward him, already aware that the day was no longer ordinary. Today, everything was about to change. Eliot's heart raced as he sprinted toward the wreck. His mind barely processed the scene in front of him. It felt almost unreal, like something out of a troubling dream. The black sedan, once polished and sleek, now sat awkwardly in a ditch, its front end pushed into the dirt. The hood was badly dented, and the windshield was shattered, the fragments glistening in the sunlight. The back end of the car was tilted at an odd angle, as if the force of the collision had pushed it into a strange, unnatural position. But it was the man lying motionless beside the car that truly stopped Eliot in his tracks. A man. At first, Eliot feared the worst. The man's body was twisted at an uncomfortable angle. His arms splayed out, and his clothes, crisp and neat, were now torn and stained. A dark mark had spread across his jacket, contrasting sharply with the pale tone of his face. The fabric was soaked, and a thin stream had run down the side of his head, pooling beneath him. Then Eliot noticed it, a slight twitch of the man's arm. It wasn't much, but enough to make Eliot's stomach tighten. The man's hand moved, reaching out, fingers trembling as though trying to grasp something. Help! Eliot's breath caught in his chest. Without thinking, he rushed toward the wreck, his pulse quickening. Each step brought him closer to the man, making the gravity of the situation more real, more immediate. The air felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. He didn't know how the accident occurred or if anyone else was involved, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting help. "Hey!" Eliot called, kneeling down beside the man. His voice was shaky but urgent. "Can you hear me? Are you okay?" The man's eyes fluttered open, slowly at first, as though the effort took everything he had. His gaze was unfocused, but after a moment, it locked onto Eliot's face, a brief flicker of recognition. "Hospital." The man's voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, but it was enough to tell Eliot what he needed to do. "Don't worry, I'll get you there," Eliot said, his voice calmer than he felt, even as panic simmered inside him. He quickly assessed the man, a middle-aged man dressed in a fine suit. The marks staining his shirt cuffs didn't match the polished appearance of his clothes. Eliot didn't know who the man was, but none of that mattered now. The man needed help, and Eliot was the only one there to offer it. Eliot carefully slid his arm under the man's head to support it, trying to keep him as still as possible. The man groaned in pain, a soft, strained sound that made Eliot's heart ache. He didn't know much about injuries, but he could tell this was serious, the way the man's body trembled, his shallow, labored breathing. "Okay," Eliot whispered to himself, his voice steady even as his heart pounded. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." Without hesitation, Eliot helped the man shift onto his knees, his hands now slick with the wetness of the man's injury. The sedan's door was still slightly open, and at first, Eliot considered pulling the man into the back seat, but the sedan was too deep in the ditch, and the rear wheels were stuck in the dirt. There was no time to move the car. Instead, Eliot gently helped the man into the passenger seat of his own car, being careful not to jolt him too much. The wreckage could wait. What mattered was getting the man to the hospital, and fast. As he buckled the man in, Eliot glanced back at the sedan. In the face of the man's injuries, the car seemed unimportant. The stains had marked the seat, but Eliot barely noticed. His mind was already focused on what needed to be done, getting the man to safety. "Hold on," Eliot murmured, slamming the car door shut. Without wasting another second, he jumped into the driver's seat. His hands gripped the wheel tightly as he shifted into gear. The engine sputtered to life with a low rumble, and the tires screeched as Eliot sped down the road, praying his old car would hold out long enough to get them to the hospital. The man, barely conscious, groaned again as Eliot drove toward the nearest emergency room. Eliot could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. There was no turning back now. This was real. This was life or death. "Just hang on," Eliot whispered, more to himself than the man. But deep down, he knew he wasn't just driving for the man. He was driving for something bigger, something that would change both their lives forever. Eliot's hands shook as he steered the car through the winding streets of Maple Ridge, the engine protesting with every turn. His old sedan, struggling to keep up with the pace, rattled like it might fall apart at any moment. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, barely giving a thought to the speed limit. The only thing that mattered now was the man beside him. The man who was barely clinging to consciousness, his face pale and drenched in sweat, his shallow breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The man's suit, once tailored to perfection, was now torn and stained with blood, the dark patches spreading across the fabric like ink on paper. His white shirt had turned crimson, the sleeves rolled up but still damp with the blood that seeped from a wound on his head. His face, though handsome in an almost angular way, was marred by bruises and dirt, the sharp jawline now soft with pain. His eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed and unfocused, before they landed on Eliot, who was trying to keep his own focus on the road ahead. The man's voice, when it came, was barely more than a strained whisper, his words slurring as if each syllable required a Herculean effort to force out. "Hospital," he gasped, his chest rising and falling with each laborious breath. Eliot couldn't tell if the man was even fully aware of his surroundings, but the word hospital was enough to ignite a spark of urgency deep within Eliot's chest. "I know," Eliot murmured, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. His mind was racing. The hospital. The nearest one was still several miles away, and the more time they spent on the road, the more likely it was that this man would slip away. Eliot's pulse quickened as the image of the man's still, broken body by the car flashed before his eyes. He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. Eliot glanced at the dashboard, the needle on the fuel gauge dangerously close to empty, and the old car groaned under the strain of speed. It wasn't much, barely enough for a trip to the corner store, let alone a hospital. He could feel the engine sputtering, the car lurching forward with the effort, and a deep sense of dread gnawed at his stomach. Please, please just hold on, he thought desperately. The man shifted beside him, wincing, and Eliot immediately reached over, his fingers brushing against the man's clammy skin. "You're okay," Eliot said, his voice trembling, even though he was trying to sound reassuring. He had no idea who this man was or why he had ended up in this wreck, but it didn't matter now. He just has to survive. That was all that mattered. The man's lips parted, and this time his voice came out clearer, though still weak. I can't breathe." Eliot felt a pang of panic as he glanced at the man, his face contorting in pain. No time for this, Eliot told himself, forcing his eyes back to the road. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. But the desperation in the man's voice was undeniable, and Eliot's heart tightened in his chest. The man's breathing was ragged, the sounds of it echoing through the car, and Eliot's stomach twisted with the thought of what might happen if he couldn't get him help in time. "Stay with me, okay?" Eliot said, his voice firmer now, though the words felt like they were being torn from his throat. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." But with every turn, every bump in the road, Eliot could feel the weight of the situation pressing down harder, suffocating him. The man's breathing was growing more labored, his hands clutching the seat beside him, as if holding on to something was the only thing keeping him tethered to life. The blood continued to seep from the wound on his head, staining the seat, and Eliot felt a pang of guilt. What if I'm too late? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the road. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and the sweat on his forehead mingled with the grime of the car. His heart raced, pounding in his ears. "Please don't die on me," he thought, his voice cracking inside his head. "Please don't die. Not like this." The road ahead was clear, but Eliot couldn't help but feel the distance stretching endlessly before him. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, and every time he glanced at the man beside him, the fear in his eyes made Eliot's stomach twist. The man's face was pale, his lips nearly ashen, and Eliot couldn't ignore the telltale signs of shock. He had to get him to the hospital. Now. The old car groaned again, and Eliot's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine protesting with a violent sputter. The dashboard lights flickered, and Eliot knew the end of the road for the car was coming soon. But there was no choice. He couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The man beside him needed him. Eliot could feel his breath quicken as the distance between them and the hospital seemed to shrink with every passing moment. The towering brick building came into view, its white lights cutting through the fading darkness of the early morning, and Eliot's heart leaped in his chest. We're almost there. His hands tightened around the wheel as he swerved into the hospital parking lot, tires screeching as he jerked the car to a stop. Without hesitation, Eliot threw the car into park, his hands already fumbling to undo his seatbelt as he swung open the door. The air was heavy with the scent of gasoline and sweat as he rushed around to the passenger side, praying that the man was still breathing, still hanging on. He opened the door, the man's limp body slumping slightly to the side, and with all the strength he could muster, Eliot carefully lifted him, half carrying, half dragging the man toward the emergency room entrance. The cold air of the hospital hit them like a slap, and Eliot's breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he burst through the automatic doors, shouting for help. Help! Someone help! Nurses rushed toward them, one of them quickly assessing the man's condition, while Eliot stood there, shaking, his hands slick with sweat and blood. His pulse thundered in his ears, but in the midst of it all, one thought burned bright in his mind. He made it. He's going to make it. Eliot's legs trembled as he rushed into the hospital's emergency room, the man's blood still staining his hands and shirt, the weight of the situation pressing down harder with every step. His breath came in jagged bursts as he shouted for help, his voice cracking with desperation. Help! Somebody, please! The nurses were quick to respond, their expressions shifting from routine professionalism to alarm as they saw the condition of the man in Eliot's arms. They were there in an instant, guiding him toward the nearest gurney, pulling it into place with smooth efficiency. Without waiting for further instruction, one of the nurses took the man from Eliot's grasp, gently lowering him onto the stretcher. She shouted orders to her colleagues, who rushed to prepare for the emergency procedures, their movements quick and practiced. Eliot stood frozen, watching as the team of medical professionals worked, a strange mixture of relief and worry flooding his chest. The immediate danger, the one that had threatened the man's life just moments ago, seemed to have passed, but Eliot couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at him. The man was still in critical condition, and there was no telling what kind of injuries he had sustained, what kind of long-term damage might have been done. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline of the moment refusing to fade. But there was no time to linger in the ER, no time to sit in the sterile silence and wait for answers. Eliot's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, the bright red numbers glaring at him. His shift at the grocery store had already started. In fact, he was now nearly half an hour late. His stomach twisted with a sudden wave of panic. He could already hear Mr. Clark's voice in his head. The manager who never tolerated tardiness, who had a zero-tolerance policy when it came to rules. Eliot's throat tightened as he realized that he'd probably lose his job over this. But there was no choice. He had to stay, had to make sure the man was going to be okay. His mind raced, torn between the conflicting emotions swirling inside him. The man's life had hung in the balance, and Eliot had done what any decent person would do. He had helped him, saved him. But now, the price was becoming painfully clear. One of the nurses glanced back at Eliot, her eyes soft with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You did the right thing, young man," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos around her. She took a moment to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You got him here in time. He's in good hands now." Eliot nodded, swallowing hard. The words were comforting, but they didn't ease the tightening knot in his chest. He watched as the nurses and doctors moved in sync, working together with precision, their focus entirely on saving the man who had been seconds away from death. The man's face was still pale, his eyes closed, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the only sign that he was still alive. Eliot's heart clenched. There was so much more to this moment than he could grasp. The man's life had been in his hands, and now he was slipping out of his grasp once again, handed over to the capable hands of the medical staff. He hadn't even asked the man's name. Who was he? What had brought him to this moment? The questions buzzed in Eliot's mind, but there was no time for answers. Not now. Eliot stepped back, out of the circle of nurses and doctors, and took one last look at the man as they wheeled him away down the hallway. The stark white lights above flickered as they disappeared through the swinging double doors, and Eliot felt a sudden emptiness settle in his stomach. He had done what he could, and now it was in the hands of the hospital. But that didn't stop the gnawing feeling of helplessness that followed him as he slowly backed away from the ER. As he turned to leave, Eliot's eyes drifted to the clock again. He was late, and his manager, Mr. Clark, wasn't going to let this slide. Eliot could already hear the reprimands in his head, the lecture about responsibility and the consequences of not following the rules. A sense of dread crept over him, his shoulders tightening as he moved toward the exit. But no matter how many times he tried to push the thought away, one truth remained. He couldn't just walk away from what had happened. His feet moved slowly, almost mechanically, as though the weight of the morning had left him in a daze. The decision to leave, to turn his back on the chaos in the ER, felt almost impossible. Yet, the reality was inescapable. The world didn't stop just because someone's life was in danger. Life went on, with its rules, its deadlines, and its harsh demands. The automatic doors to the hospital swished open as Eliot stepped out into the bright morning light. The fresh air hit him like a wave, but it did little to ease the pressure building in his chest. His old car was still parked outside, just where he had left it. The engine was a distant hum in the back of his mind, and Eliot took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. He could feel the weight of the decision as he climbed into his car. His fingers brushed against the wheel, but for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences. The hospital, with its sterile hallways and life-or-death drama, had momentarily erased the mundane world of grocery store shifts and angry managers. But now, that world came crashing back in. Eliot started the car with a hesitant turn of the key, the engine sputtering to life once more. The familiar rattle sounded, like an old friend trying to offer comfort, but it didn't work. He was already late, and he knew that this day would only get worse from here. As the car pulled back onto the road, Eliot couldn't help but glance back at the hospital. He hoped the man would be okay, that the doctors would work miracles. But in the pit of his stomach, something told him that the day was far from over. His life, and the life of the man he had just saved, was about to change forever. The familiar parking lot of Maple Ridge Market came into view as Eliot's car sputtered and rattled its way down the lane. The early morning sunlight had begun to warm the air, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. It was almost a surreal contrast to the chaos of the past hour, an hour that had felt like a blur of emergency room lights, pulsing adrenaline, and the crushing weight of responsibility. The car slowed to a stop near the employee entrance, and Eliot's stomach twisted into tight knots, his nerves a gnawing presence in the pit of his stomach. His hands felt clammy on the steering wheel as he shifted the car into park. The clock on the dashboard blinked mockingly at him. 25 minutes late. He exhaled sharply, the weight of the lateness settling over him like an anchor, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to move. His thoughts were still a jumble of images: the wrecked car, the man's pale face, the frantic trip to the hospital. He had just saved a life, but all that seemed to matter now was that he was late for work. The rules, the policies, the judgment that would come crashing down on him for not showing up on time. Eliot rubbed a hand over his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion and anxiety that threatened to drown him. He had never been one to break the rules, never been one to put himself in a position to get into trouble. But today had been different. He had done what he believed was right, and yet here he was about to face the consequences. As he stepped out of the car, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement echoed in the stillness of the morning. His heart was pounding, his mind already racing ahead to what would come next. He knew Mr. Thompson wouldn't be happy. Mr. Thompson never was. Eliot's stomach churned as he made his way to the back entrance of the grocery store. The large metal door loomed before him, the entrance a gateway to the world he'd been a part of for the past 2 years. The world of aisles stacked high with canned goods, of stale fluorescent lights, and the hum of registers ringing up mundane transactions. It felt so distant now, almost alien, after the life-or-death moments he'd experienced earlier. He reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, it swung open with a creak, and there stood Mr. Thompson. The older man was a rigid figure, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in that permanent disapproving scowl that Eliot had come to dread over the months. The moment Mr. Thompson saw Eliot, his eyes narrowed and the silence between them stretched painfully. "You're late." Mr. Thompson's voice was sharp, like the crack of a whip. Eliot winced, the words stinging more than he expected. He had expected it. Of course he had. But hearing it out loud, after everything that had just happened, felt like a blow to the chest. He opened his mouth to explain, to tell Mr. Thompson about the accident, about the man he had saved, but before he could get a single word out, Mr. Thompson cut him off. "I don't care about your excuses, Eliot," Mr. Thompson said, his tone icy. "I've told you before, late is late. Doesn't matter what the reason is. And you're 25 minutes late, so I'm not hearing it." Eliot's throat tightened, the words clogging up inside of him. He tried to push them out, tried to make Mr. Thompson understand, but he knew it was pointless. He had seen Mr. Thompson's attitude toward tardiness before, had witnessed the way he treated other employees who dared show up even a minute late. There was no leeway with him, no compassion for the circumstances. It was all about the rules. Always. There was an accident," Eliot started, his voice coming out rough, his chest tightening with frustration. I had to help someone. A man was hurt, and I don't care, Eliot," Mr. Thompson interrupted again, his voice cold and firm. He took a step forward, towering over Eliot as his eyes bored into him with the weight of authority. "You think I'm running a daycare here? You think I have time to make exceptions for every sob story that comes through my door? No one cares about your problems. You show up on time, or you don't show up at all." Eliot's pulse quickened, a hot rush of anger surging through him. The words hit harder than they should have, the unfairness of it all burning in his chest. He had saved a life. He had done the right thing. And this was the response he got? His grip tightened on the door frame, his knuckles white from the pressure. He wanted to shout, to tell Mr. Thompson just how wrong he was, to scream about the man in the hospital, to demand some kind of understanding, some kind of recognition for the act of courage he had shown. But the words got stuck somewhere deep in his throat, and all he could do was stare at the man who was now his employer and feel the crushing weight of it all. Mr. Thompson's voice dropped even lower, a cold finality in it now. "You're fired, Eliot." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Eliot felt the ground shift beneath him, his entire body frozen as the reality of what had just happened settled into his bones. Fired. It was the word he had feared, the word he had dreaded. His pulse raced, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin. "Fired?" Eliot repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't comprehend it. All of his efforts, everything he had done to be a good worker, to be on time, to follow the rules, had come down to this, to being fired for helping someone in need. "Mr. Biden." Thompson's gaze never wavered, his expression as cold and indifferent as ever. "You don't make the rules here, Eliot. I do. And I don't tolerate tardiness, no matter who you think you're saving." Eliot stood there, stunned. The anger, the frustration, the disbelief, it all swirled inside of him like a storm. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. There was no point. He had nothing left to say. Without another word, he turned away from the door and walked past Mr. Thompson, his footsteps sounding hollow on the linoleum floor. The door slammed shut behind him with an almost final echo. The sense of defeat was suffocating, a sharp contrast to the relief he had felt earlier in the hospital. Now, there was nothing but emptiness. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he left the store behind, the door shutting with a cold finality. Eliot didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this be the end of it. Eliot's feet barely made a sound as he walked away from Maple Ridge Market, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The harsh words of Mr. Thompson echoed in his mind, repeating in a cruel loop like an endless drumbeat. "You're fired." It was the only phrase that seemed to matter now. As he walked, his head lowered, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The cool breeze of the morning was no comfort. It only reminded him of how out of place he felt in the world around him. Everything was wrong. His job was gone, and the man he had helped was still in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. The day had shifted from one of hope to one of disillusionment, and Eliot wasn't sure how to make sense of it all. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet seemed to know the way. The path led him to Maggie's Diner, a small, family-owned spot tucked away in a corner of Maple Ridge that smelled like coffee and pancakes and comfort. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you could breathe, like the chaos of the world could be left at the door. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, the hum of quiet conversations blending with the soft clink of silverware and plates. The bell above the door jingled softly as Eliot stepped inside, the scent of bacon and eggs instantly wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. He slid onto a stool at the counter, resting his elbows on the cold formica, his gaze unfocused as he stared down at the menu in front of him. But he wasn't really looking. His mind was elsewhere, on the wrecked car, the blood-stained hands, the terrified expression of the man he had pulled from the wreckage. What had it all been for? He had done the right thing, hadn't he? The words swirled around in his mind like a dizzying whirlpool. He had acted instinctively, driven by a sense of humanity. But now that the adrenaline had worn off, the consequences of his actions had come crashing down on him. He had been fired. He had no job, no money, no clear path forward. A soft clink of ceramic brought him back to reality. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an apron worn from years of service, set a cup of coffee in front of him. Her smile was warm, sympathetic, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Eliot nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't say anything. He picked up the cup, feeling the warmth radiate through the porcelain, and took a slow sip. The bitter taste of the coffee seemed to clear his mind, but only slightly. The knot in his stomach tightened as he looked down at the dark liquid, trying to push away the thoughts that were threatening to overwhelm him. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging, stretching the silence between him and the world around him. The gentle hum of the diner filled the space, but it felt far away, like he was in a different world entirely. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in the hospital, the look in the man's eyes as he had been wheeled away, and the words of the nurse telling him that he had done the right thing. Yet, every time he tried to grasp that sense of validation, it slipped through his fingers, replaced by the sting of his firing. The words kept echoing in his mind. Late is late. Doesn't matter what the reason is. Eliot closed his eyes briefly, trying to breathe through the frustration building inside him. His fingers tightened around the cup, and he whispered to himself, just loud enough for the words to escape his lips. I did the right thing, but it still hurts. The weight of those words hung in the air between him and the diner's worn counter. He had made a choice that went against the rigid rules he had lived by. He hadn't hesitated to stop and help the man, even when he knew it might cost him his job. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, the cost seemed too high. What good was doing the right thing if it meant losing everything? The waitress returned, refilling his coffee cup without asking. Eliot hadn't even noticed that it had gone cold. As she did, she offered him a small, understanding smile, but he couldn't bring himself to return it. She lingered for a moment, looking at him with a gentle concern that he couldn't bear to acknowledge. You okay, honey? She asked softly, her voice full of quiet empathy. Eliot didn't know how to answer. How could he explain it? How could he put into words the tangled mess of emotions, the conflict between his pride for doing the right thing and the deep frustration over the consequences? He didn't have the words, not yet. So instead, he just nodded, a thin, uncertain smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll be fine, he said, though even to his own ears, the words didn't sound convincing. The waitress didn't push. She simply nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer, before she turned to serve another customer. Eliot sat there, sipping his coffee, trying to find some semblance of clarity in the swirl of his thoughts. The diner was quiet, a haven of stillness in the middle of his storm. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself to sit with the confusion, to embrace the conflicting emotions that churned inside of him. He couldn't change what had happened. The firing was done. The decision had been made. But as he sat there, the words the nurse had said to him earlier resurfaced. You did the right thing. The right thing. The words echoed like a reminder, a small but steady voice in his head that refused to be silenced. He had made the decision to act based on what he believed was right, even when it meant risking his job. And in that moment, He realized something he hadn't fully understood before. Doing the right thing wasn't always about the immediate reward. It wasn't about the approval of others or the recognition of his actions. It was about knowing, deep down, that he had stayed true to himself, to his values, even when it hurt, even when it cost him. The ache in his chest wasn't going to vanish right away. The uncertainty about the future, about what came next, still loomed large. But for the first time since the accident, Eliot felt a flicker of something like peace, a quiet acceptance that, while the path ahead was unclear, at least he had done something that mattered. He finished his coffee, setting the empty cup down with a soft clink. The world outside was still waiting for him, and it wasn't going to slow down. But for now, for this brief moment, Eliot allowed himself the space to breathe, to reflect. And as he stood up to leave the diner, a quiet thought echoed in his mind. It's not about what you lose. It's about what you've gained in the process. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the low hum of hospital machinery surrounded Gregory Kingsley as he slowly regained consciousness. His head was heavy, his body aching, as if he had been torn apart and stitched back together, but there was an underlying warmth, a kind of soft relief that slowly edged away the haze of pain. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust to the harsh lights overhead, and then he saw her. Anna, his wife, was sitting beside him, her hand gently resting on his. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a mixture of worry and exhaustion. When she saw him stir, she let out a soft gasp and leaned forward, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "Gregory," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're awake. Thank God." He tried to smile, but the movement was sluggish, and his throat felt dry as if he hadn't spoken in days. His mind was still trying to catch up to reality, but one thing was painfully clear. He had been in an accident. He remembered the crash, the screech of metal against concrete, the violent jolt of impact, and then nothing. The void that followed was still too fresh, the details too blurry to grasp fully. "What happened?" he croaked, his voice weak. Anna squeezed his hand, the warmth of her touch a steady comfort as she explained. "You were in a car accident. A man, Eliot, I think his name was, stopped and helped you. He got you to the hospital. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." Gregory's mind swirled, the fog of confusion lifting just enough for a new image to emerge. Eliot, the young man who had risked everything to save him, who had pulled him from the wreckage and driven him to safety when no one else had been around. His heart ached with gratitude and a strange, deep feeling of indebtedness. Whoever Eliot was, he had given Gregory something far beyond a mere second chance at life. He had given him hope, an unspoken trust that not everyone in the world had forgotten how to care for others. "Eliot," Gregory repeated softly, trying to commit the name to memory. "Where is he? Is he all right?" Anna shook her head, her eyes welling with tears as she glanced toward the nurse standing by the door. "We don't know. We tried to find him, but no one seems to know where he went. He didn't leave any contact details. We've been asking around, hoping someone would know how to reach him." Gregory's brows furrowed with concern. "He didn't leave a name? After everything?" Anna sighed, and there was a moment of silence between them, the weight of the situation sinking in. Her voice was thick with emotion as she added, "He just disappeared. He saved you and then just left. We were hoping you could tell us something. Anything." Gregory's mind raced. The young man's selflessness had been so pure, so immediate, that it was almost beyond belief. It didn't make sense that someone like Eliot would simply vanish, not after all he had done. There had to be more to the story. And as much as he wanted to rest, to focus on his own recovery, one thought kept pushing its way to the forefront of his mind. He had to find Eliot. He had to thank him properly. He had to make sure Eliot knew that his actions hadn't been in vain. "We have to find him, Anna," Gregory said, his voice firmer now, though still strained from the pain in his chest. "I don't care what it takes. He saved my life. I need to find him." Anna nodded, the fire of determination kindling in her own eyes. "I agree. We'll find him." It wasn't long before the Kingsleys, with the help of the hospital staff and the police, began their search for Eliot. They called the local precinct, hoping to track down any information, and after a few hours of digging, the pieces began to fall into place. The authorities weren't able to find much on Eliot's whereabouts at first. He didn't have any listed emergency contacts or an address on record that was easy to find. But they did manage to connect a few dots. A few locals remembered a young man working at Maple Ridge Market. After a few inquiries, they were able to give Anna and Gregory a lead. Eliot's address. It was a small, modest home on the outskirts of town. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed wealth or status. Just a quiet, unassuming house that fit the life Eliot had probably led. A life where helping others was more important than collecting accolades or attention. Anna's fingers gripped the steering wheel as they drove toward the house, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Gregory sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the passing landscape. His mind was filled with a million questions. Questions about Eliot's life, why he had been so quick to help a complete stranger, why he had disappeared without a trace. But one thing was clear. Eliot had become more than just a rescuer in Gregory's mind. He had become a symbol of what humanity could be at its best. He was the proof that kindness, selflessness, and integrity still had a place in the world. They arrived at the address shortly after, pulling up to a modest house that had a small, overgrown garden in the front yard. The house was quiet, with no cars in the driveway. Anna and Gregory exchanged a brief look before stepping out of the car. They approached the front door, Anna's fingers nervously brushing through her hair as she knocked softly. The sound echoed through the silence of the neighborhood. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing a young man, Eliot. His expression was guarded, his eyes weary, as if he hadn't expected anyone to show up at his door. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice tentative but polite. Anna's heart leapt at the sight of him. This was him. This was the man who had saved her husband's life. "You're Eliot, right?" Anna asked gently, trying to keep the tremor of emotion out of her voice. "We're the Kingsleys. Gregory, the man you saved." Eliot blinked, clearly surprised, his face unreadable. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice low. "You're the Kingsleys?" Gregory stepped forward, his hand outstretched in greeting. His voice, when it came, was full of warmth and gratitude. "Yes, Gregory Kingsley, and I want to thank you. Thank you for saving me. I owe you everything." Eliot looked down at the ground for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. He shifted on his feet, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what anyone would do in that situation." Gregory shook his head. "No, Eliot. Not everyone would do what you did. You saved my life. I may not know you, but I know that doesn't happen by accident. You're a good man." Eliot didn't know what to say. The words felt strange coming from someone like Gregory, someone who had just experienced a life-or-death moment. And for the first time, Eliot realized that what he had done wasn't just about the immediate act. It was about how that act had changed everything for Gregory and Anna. How something as simple as stopping to help had ripple effects far beyond what he could have imagined. Anna stepped forward as well, her voice soft. "We've been looking for you. We wanted to thank you properly. What you did, it wasn't just life-saving. It was life-changing." Eliot's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of humility. He hadn't done it for the thanks, hadn't done it to be noticed. But standing here, face to face with the man whose life he had saved, it felt different. It felt like he had done something that actually mattered. I didn't expect this," Eliot muttered, his voice almost lost in the breeze. Anna smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You didn't have to expect it. You just had to know that you made a difference. And that's enough." The Kingsleys stood there for a moment, sharing a silent understanding with Eliot, the weight of what had transpired between them hanging in the air like a delicate thread. It wasn't just gratitude, it was connection. It was a bond forged in a moment of crisis, a bond that neither of them would ever forget. And as they stood there on the doorstep, something else began to form in Eliot's chest, a sense of purpose. The world didn't always reward the right actions immediately, and sometimes it could feel like doing the right thing was a thankless task. But in that moment, with the Kingsleys standing before him, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. Kindness wasn't about being recognized. It was about the impact it left behind. The familiar sight of his house loomed ahead as Eliot turned the corner onto his street. the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. He was still wrestling with the emotions from his unexpected encounter with Gregory and Anna Kingsley. Their words had stuck with him, echoing in his mind like a melody that he couldn't quite shake. The gratitude in their eyes had been overwhelming, and while it was impossible to deny the warmth it had stirred in him, it was also deeply uncomfortable. He hadn't done anything special. He had just acted. Yet, somehow, it felt as though they had placed a weight on his shoulders, one he didn't know if he was ready to carry. As he pulled into his driveway, the usual calm of his neighborhood seemed off. There was a police cruiser parked by the curb, its flashing lights casting a strange glow across the street. Next to it, a sleek black SUV stood, its polished surface gleaming in the fading light of the day. Eliot's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he parked his car and cut the engine. Liam and Sophie were standing by the front door, their expressions a mix of confusion and worry. Eliot's younger siblings were never ones to get into trouble, but the sight of the cruiser had them on edge. Liam, barely 12 but already tall for his age, looked at him anxiously as he walked toward them. "Eliot, what's going on?" Liam asked, his voice unsure. Sophie, who was a few years younger, clung to her older brother's side, her eyes wide with concern. Eliot smiled at them, trying to mask the unease in his chest. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had to reassure them. "Nothing to worry about, you two," he said, though the words felt hollow as they left his lips. "I'll figure it out. Just hang tight for a second." Sophie looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "But why are the police here?" "I don't know," Eliot replied, his voice softer now. "But it's probably about something else. Maybe a misunderstanding, or... I don't know. I'll take care of it." With a deep breath, Eliot stepped around them and made his way to the front steps, the sound of his sneakers tapping against the pavement feeling louder than usual in the quiet evening air. The police officer, who had been standing near the cruiser, straightened up as Eliot approached, his eyes narrowing slightly as though assessing him. Eliot's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He was used to dealing with questions from strangers in the neighborhood. There were times when he and his friends had been questioned by the local patrol for one thing or another. But this felt different. Just as Eliot was about to ask what was going on, the officer spoke first. "You Eliot Hayes?" he asked, his voice authoritative but not unfriendly. "Yeah, that's me," Eliot said, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer motioned for him to come closer, and Eliot obeyed, his curiosity growing with every step. Before he could ask another question, the sleek black SUV's door swung open, and two figures stepped out. The first was a tall man in a well-tailored suit, his features sharp and defined, with a look that immediately spoke of confidence, of someone used to commanding attention. The woman beside him was elegant, with dark hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She carried herself with a calm dignity, her eyes scanning the surroundings before they landed on Eliot. Eliot froze for a moment, his mind racing. It didn't take long to recognize them. It was Gregory and Anna Kingsley, the couple he had met earlier that day. The ones whose lives he had so casually, almost impulsively, altered with a single act of kindness. And now they were standing in front of him, looking at him with expressions that mixed both gratitude and something deeper. Something he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Hayes," Gregory said, his voice warm yet filled with an undeniable sense of purpose. "I'm Gregory Kingsley, and this is my wife, Anna. I think we've already met earlier today." Eliot blinked, his mouth going dry. He had never expected to see them again, especially not in front of his own home, with a police car and a high-end SUV parked in his driveway. What's all this? I don't understand." Gregory cut him off, smiling faintly as he took a step closer. "It's a little strange, I admit. But what we're here to talk about is nothing but gratitude." He paused, his gaze steady on Eliot's face. "You saved my life, Mr. Hayes, and my wife and I feel we owe you more than a simple thank you. We want to make sure that you understand how much that moment meant to us." Eliot's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. His initial instinct was to shake his head and downplay it, to brush it off as just another thing he had done without thinking. But as he looked at Anna, her eyes glistening with emotion, he realized they weren't just here to thank him. This was something more, something deeper. and it filled him with a strange mixture of humility and confusion. I didn't. I just did what anyone would do, Eliot stammered, suddenly unsure of how to handle the situation. The weight of their gratitude was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure how to bear it. Anna stepped forward, her voice soft yet firm. Eliot, what you did wasn't something just anyone would do. You saved my husband's life. You gave us a second chance when we thought all was lost. You don't understand the depth of what that means to us. Eliot shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of their words. He hadn't expected to be put on a pedestal like this, to be held in such high regard for something that had felt so instinctive to him. He had simply acted, no more, no less. But the sincerity in their voices, the way they looked at him, like he had somehow turned the impossible into something real, it was something he wasn't sure how to process. Anna gave him a kind but firm look. We wanted to find you, Eliot, to make sure you understood how much we appreciate what you did. But it's more than that. She paused, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. We're here because we want to offer our help, whatever you need. My husband and I want to support you, whether that's helping you with school, with your family, whatever you might need. Eliot blinked, stunned. Support? His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. This couldn't be real. Why would they want to help him? He was just a guy who had helped them, someone who was just trying to get by. I didn't do this for anything in return. Gregory interrupted him, his voice calm and steady. You don't need to explain. We're not offering this because you owe us anything. We're offering it because what you did meant more than just a rescue. It was an act of humanity, one that deserves more than just a thank you. The words lingered between them, filling the quiet evening air with something heavier than gratitude, something that Eliot wasn't sure how to carry. As his eyes shifted from Gregory to Anna, Eliot felt the weight of the moment, the magnitude of the decision that was being offered to him. Help. Support. A chance at something better, something that went beyond just surviving. It was an unexpected gift, one that Eliot had never considered he might receive. I don't know what to say, Eliot finally whispered, his voice small. I didn't expect this. I never thought. You don't have to say anything, Gregory said, his smile kind and reassuring. Just know that whatever happens from here on out, we're here for you. You don't have to face this alone. Eliot nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of their offer and the deep sense of gratitude that swelled inside him. It was a feeling he wasn't sure how to handle, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like something worth carrying. The evening stretched on, but Eliot stood frozen in place, caught between a whirlwind of emotions. The conversation with Gregory and Anna had turned from overwhelming gratitude into something entirely unexpected, an offer that could change everything. Their words echoed in his mind, each syllable heavier than the last. We want to help you, Eliot, Gregory had said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable earnestness. We know this wasn't a small thing. What you did for us was beyond what we could ever repay. And we're not going to leave you struggling because of it. That's not how this works. You gave us our lives back, and we want to do the same for you. Eliot's heart pounded in his chest. Help? What kind of help could someone like them, someone so wealthy and influential, offer someone like him? His family barely scraped by month to month. His mother's medical bills were a constant burden. They lived paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes not even that. He had dreams, sure, but dreams seemed far off, as distant and fragile as stars. Anna stepped forward, her eyes soft yet unwavering. Eliot, we're serious. We know it's a lot to take in, but we're here to offer more than just words. We'll take care of your mother's bills. We'll help you with your education. Whatever you need to get where you want to go. We've been lucky enough to be given a second chance at life, and we want to make sure you get yours. His stomach tightened. The weight of their offer was both an incredible gift and a heavy burden he hadn't been prepared for. He wanted to help his family. He wanted to give them everything they deserved. But how could he possibly accept help from strangers, no matter how well-intentioned they were? Eliot opened his mouth, about to protest, but Gregory raised a hand, stopping him. We're not offering charity, Eliot, Gregory said, his voice firm but understanding. This isn't about us giving you something because we pity you or feel indebted. This is us trying to return the favor for what you did. You saved my life, and we want to help you live yours without the weight of financial struggles holding you back. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Live yours. It was something Eliot hadn't truly believed was possible for him. To live a life without always fighting, always scrapping for the next meal, the next bill to pay. To not be tethered by the constant weight of financial insecurity. It was almost too much to imagine. He shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. I didn't do what I did to get anything in return. I just did what anyone would do, you know? Anna smiled gently, her hand resting on Gregory's arm. Eliot, it's not about what you did. It's about what we can do now. We're in a position to give you and your family something that could make all the difference. You've spent your whole life looking after others. Let us help you. Let us give you that same chance you gave us. Eliot's mind swirled. His mother, Claudia, had been struggling for months with her health. The medical bills piled up faster than they could be paid, and the stress of it was wearing her down. She'd been diagnosed with a chronic condition, and though she had the strength of a lion, even she couldn't keep fighting the battle alone. Eliot had worked himself into the ground to make sure she didn't have to face it alone, but at times it felt like he was just treading water. And then there was school, his future. He had the grades, the drive, but his prospects had always seemed limited by his circumstances. College was a distant dream, one he'd pushed aside for practical concerns. How would they afford tuition? Would they even be able to pay for his textbooks, let alone housing? But now, standing in front of him was an opportunity that could change everything. And yet, the thought of accepting it made him feel like he was selling a part of himself. As though sensing his hesitation, Anna spoke again. Eliot, I know this isn't easy. It's not meant to be. But sometimes we need to let others help us, especially when it's someone who wants nothing but to repay an act of kindness. The weight of their words settled into Eliot's chest like a stone, pressing him down. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something life-altering, something that could either pull him into a future of possibilities or send him spiraling into the fear of losing his independence, his sense of pride. He didn't know what to say, how to make sense of it all. Just then, a voice broke into his thoughts. Take it, Eliot, please. It was his mother, Claudia. She had been standing in the doorway the whole time, quietly listening, her expression soft yet filled with understanding. She walked forward, her tired face lighting up with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Mom, Eliot began, stepping toward her, but she raised a hand, silencing him. I know what you're thinking, she said gently. You don't want to accept help from strangers. You don't want to feel like you owe anyone. But this isn't just about you, Eliot. It's about us, about our family. We've struggled so much, and you've worked yourself to the bone for us. You've given so much. Let someone else give back. Let someone else help carry this load for a while. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness in it that tugged at Eliot's heart. His mother, who had always been the one to hold everything together, the one to take care of him and his siblings, was asking him to accept help, to let go of his pride for once and allow someone to lift the burden from their shoulders. Eliot felt the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket, warming him in a way he hadn't expected. His throat tightened. He'd spent so much of his life trying to be the strong one, trying to protect his family from the harsh realities of the world. But what if accepting help didn't make him weak? What if it made him stronger? Turning back to Gregory and Anna, Eliot finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, but filled with a newfound clarity. I'll accept your help. For my family. For my mom. Gregory nodded, his smile genuine, as if he had known all along that Eliot would make this choice. Anna's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on Eliot's shoulder, giving him a gentle squeeze. You won't regret this, Eliot. We're not doing this for you to owe us. We're doing it because you deserve the chance to live without constantly worrying about how to get by. We're doing this because you've given us something that can never be repaid. Eliot nodded, a small but grateful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, like a tiny ember that could grow into something brighter. As the Kingsleys left, promising to work out the details of their offer, Eliot turned to his mother, who stood there watching him with a look of pride. "You made the right choice," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "This could change everything for us. For you." And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Eliot allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be brighter than he had ever dared to hope. Eliot had always been a fighter, but for the first time in his life, it felt like he wasn't alone in the battle. The Kingsleys' generosity didn't just give him financial support, it gave him the space to dream, the freedom to focus, and the peace of mind to concentrate on what really mattered. With their help, he returned to school, his head no longer clouded with worry about how he would pay for his next textbook or whether his mother would be able to make it through another round of treatments. Instead, he threw himself into his studies with a sense of purpose he had never known before. The burden of survival was lifted, and in its place, a spark ignited inside him. Eliot excelled in his classes, his grades skyrocketing as he spent late nights poring over textbooks and assignments, determined not to waste the second chance he had been given. His teachers noticed the transformation immediately, not just in his academic performance, but in the way he carried himself. More confident, more focused, more willing to contribute. He wasn't the quiet, withdrawn student from before. He was someone who had something to say, someone who believed in the future for the first time in a long while. Gregory and Anna, true to their word, didn't just write checks. They became active mentors. They checked in on him regularly, providing guidance, advice, and encouragement, but they never imposed their views. Instead, they helped him see the world through a different lens, one where opportunity wasn't something that came by luck, but by hard work and making the most of what you had. Gregory, in particular, took him under his wing, teaching him the ropes of the business world and showing him what it meant to be a leader who led with integrity and kindness. Eliot finished high school with a strong academic record, a scholarship offer to a prestigious university, and more importantly, a sense of direction. The path ahead no longer seemed impossible. It was one he could walk with confidence. And so he did. He graduated from college with honors, securing a job in a field he had once thought out of reach: technology and innovation. His work ethic, his sharp mind, and the lessons he had learned from Gregory all propelled him to the top. Within a few years, he found himself climbing the corporate ladder, moving up from entry level to management, from management to executive leadership. His rise wasn't meteoric. It was earned, step by step, decision by decision. But as the years passed, Eliot looked back at where he had started and marveled at how far he had come. What once seemed like an insurmountable mountain had been reduced to nothing more than a series of challenges, each one overcome with the support of those who believed in him. And in turn, Eliot began to believe in himself. He never forgot Gregory and Anna, the couple who had shown him that kindness and opportunity could change the course of a life. They had become like family to him, their guidance an unshakable foundation on which he built everything that followed. He never stopped thanking them, sometimes with words, sometimes with small gestures, because he knew that without them, he wouldn't be where he was. They had given him more than just a financial lifeline. They had given him a chance to live with purpose, to aim for something bigger than survival. Eliot's success didn't end with his career. He had become a mentor in his own right, helping those who were where he once was, struggling to get by, dreaming of a better future, but unsure how to reach it. He shared his story of perseverance and the importance of never losing sight of one's dreams, even in the face of hardship. He spoke to groups of young people, hoping to inspire them the way Gregory and Anna had inspired him. He built programs in his company to offer internships and scholarships to disadvantaged youth, making sure that others had the same chance to succeed that he had been given. One afternoon, years later, Eliot found himself standing behind a podium at a large conference, speaking to a packed room of students, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. His story was one of resilience, of rising from the ashes, of turning a single act of kindness into a life of purpose. He spoke with passion, not just about his journey, but about the importance of kindness, hard work, and the power of human connection. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of his words settle over the room. He could see the faces in the crowd, young people whose eyes were filled with the same uncertainty he had once known. He knew that his story would resonate with them, just as Gregory's had resonated with him. He wasn't just sharing his success. He was giving them a glimmer of hope, showing them that no matter where they came from, they had the power to change their own lives. From the corner of the room, Gregory watched with quiet pride. Now retired, he had stepped away from the world of business to focus on his family, but he still kept an eye on Eliot, his surrogate son. He knew how far Eliot had come, and the thought of it filled him with a deep, unspoken joy. Gregory had always believed that success was not measured by wealth or status, but by the impact you had on others, by the way you could lift someone up and change their trajectory. And that's what Eliot had done. Gregory leaned back in his seat, his heart full as he watched Eliot continue to speak, his voice steady and sure. The room was hanging on his every word, and Gregory knew that this was the moment that mattered. This was the moment where one life had inspired so many others. As Eliot finished his speech and the crowd erupted into applause, he scanned the room, his eyes locking with Gregory's. The older man gave him a small, knowing smile, one that held a lifetime of gratitude, understanding, and pride. Eliot's eyes glistened as he spoke his final words into the microphone. Success isn't about what you have or what you achieve on your own. It's about the people you help along the way. I stand here today because of one person's kindness, and I vow to pass that kindness forward every single day for the rest of my life. The applause roared once more, but for Eliot, the moment was no longer about recognition. It was about the legacy he was creating. It was about the lives he would touch, the lessons he would share, and the way he would continue to make a difference, just as someone had once made a difference for him. And in the back of the room, Gregory's eyes never left Eliot. He knew that this was the true gift, not just a life saved, but a life lived with purpose, reaching others and changing the world, one act of kindness at a time. As the applause began to fade, Eliot stood at the podium, his heart still racing. The lights overhead were bright, and the echo of the crowd's admiration still filled his ears. But for a moment, everything seemed to pause. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It wasn't the recognition. It wasn't the title or the accomplishments that had brought him here. It was the simple truth that had guided him all these years, the truth that had reshaped his life. One act of kindness had the power to change everything. Eliot's gaze shifted to the back of the room, where Gregory sat, smiling, a quiet pride in his eyes. In that moment, Eliot understood something he had never fully grasped until now. His success wasn't just a result of his hard work or the opportunities he'd been given. It was because, somewhere along the way, someone had believed in him. They had seen the potential he couldn't even see in himself. Gregory's kindness had lit the spark that ignited everything that followed. And now, standing here, Eliot knew it was his turn to keep that light burning, to pass it on. As he stepped down from the podium, the room still buzzing with energy, he felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. The struggle, the sacrifice, the long years of uncertainty, they had all led to this moment, not because of what he had achieved, but because of what he had learned along the way. That success is never about the destination. It's about the people you meet, the kindness you give, and the lives you touch. Eliot walked off the stage and made his way toward the back of the room, where Gregory waited, arms open, ready to embrace him as he always had. Eliot could feel the weight of the years, the moments of doubt, the challenges, the fears that had almost kept him from moving forward. But none of them seemed as important anymore. What mattered was the journey, the people who had walked with him, and the knowledge that he could now give that same hope to others. Gregory pulled him into a warm hug, his voice low and filled with emotion. "You did it, Eliot. I'm so proud of you." Eliot held him for a moment, the words catching in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without you, I would have never known what it felt like to believe in myself." Gregory chuckled softly, pulling away just enough to look Eliot in the eyes. "You did the hard work, son. You always had it in you. I just helped you see it." And in that moment, Eliot realized something he hadn't understood when he was younger. That kindness, that unwavering belief in someone's potential, was the most powerful thing in the world. It wasn't the wealth or the accolades that defined a life. It was the connections we make, the hands we extend, and the difference we make in the lives of others. The room had emptied now. But Eliot stood there, grateful for the people who had lifted him up and determined to do the same for others. He had built a life, a future, a legacy, not through luck, not through fate, but through the people who had given him a chance. And as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he knew the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. With every step forward, he carried with him the knowledge that one act of kindness, the simplest, most unexpected kindness, could transform a life. And for the rest of his days, he would make sure to pass that light forward, just as it had been passed to him. Because, in the end, that was the most important thing, to make a difference, to offer someone else a chance, to change a life the way his had been changed. And with that thought, Eliot took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. The world was full of opportunities, full of moments just waiting to be shaped. And he would face them all with the same courage and determination that had brought him this far. Because now he knew the power of kindness, and nothing, he realized, could ever hold him back again. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. I truly hope this story has brought you some inspiration and meaningful moments. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Feel free to share this video with your friends and loved ones to spread the positive message. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on future videos. Your support means the world to me, and every like, comment, and share motivates me to keep creating better content for you all. Thanks again for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.